Hi guys, it's Papa G, and part of folklore is fairy tales. So I thought we would go over the origins of European fairy tales today. And they have a lot of significant beliefs that are part of the European culture. They've been that way for a long time, and they've always had audiences. These magical stories, and they had moral lessons. But these tales and their origins, they're mainly from oral traditions that are centuries year old. They went into written literature, and then later on, they put this web of cultural beliefs and historical events that have shaped them. In the early beginnings, oral traditions and ancient influences, these were the earliest European fairy tales, and they originated from oral stories that were passed down from generation to generation. And these stories have served as both a form of entertainment and a method of communication. And communities use storytelling to convey things like moral lessons, so societal norms, communal values. They were supposed to be teaching you something, how to grow up. And these early narratives were significantly influenced by ancient mythologies, such as those from like Greece and Rome. All these stories of the myths of the gods and the heroes and monsters were revitalized in the tales told around around the hearth in these European homes. But the role of folklore, I mean, it formed the foundation of early fairy tales. That's how folklore worked its way into it throughout the region, and all of Europe had its own set of distinct legends and myths and folk stories that influenced all these local fairy tales. For example, the Germanic tribes had all these mythologies that included tales of dragons and witches and enchanted forests. In Celtic folklore, with its focus on the mystical and the otherworldly, it would often inspire tales that involve fairies and leprechauns and all these magical transformations like shapeshifters and things like that. So, if we go into the medieval period, I mean, that's a period of chivalry and Christianity is taking place. And during this time, this chivalric romance was incorporated into European fairy tales. And there were virtues like the knight saving the princess, and there was courage and honor and courtly love. And they were all these prominent themes that were in fairy tales. So, and they get influenced by Christianity, which is playing a significant role in the shaping of these narratives at the time. So they get all these Christian elements, which include conflicts between good and evil, and like redemption and the power of faith. And they were like seamlessly woven into these stories. So you get all that influence of Christianity into them. And in the medieval period, all these historical events also had significant impact on fairy tales. For example, during the Crusades, um, it exposed Europeans to storytelling traditions of the Middle East during the Crusades. It would bring all these new narrative patterns and had all these exotic elements to the European fairy tale. Of the bubonic plague, which totally devastated Europe in the 14th century, added these darker and more cautionary tones to the stories, and they reflected the anxieties at the time, what people were really worried about. And then we get into the revival of classical antiquities in the Renaissance, and there was this renewed interest in what we call classical antiquity, which brought a new level of sophistication to fairy tales. So these scholars and writers started collecting and publishing these stories because here we move into the time of printing, and it would preserve them for the future generations that we sometimes retell. So the tales were no longer only a part of oral tradition, but they also became the subject of literary exploration. And the printing press is one of the most significant developments during the Renaissance. I mean, people began printing the Bible. People began writing books. Some not really newspapers, but there was news pamphlets put out. It happened around 1440, where they did the printing press. But fairy tales, along with other forms of literature, benefited from this greatly. I mean, the publication of there was something I think it was the Facetious Knights of Strapola or something, um, and it was like this early example of how some of these fairy tales went from oral to literary. Um, Moral lessons, were now in print. So it kind of turned their national identity during this Enlightenment period. There was a focus on reason and order and logic, which had this impact on the moral nature of fairy tales. So stories from this time often included explicit lessons meant to teach children about proper behavior, just like they did when they were oral. So this period also marked an increase in nationalism as countries aimed to establish their cultural identities. These fairy tales were gathered and published, and what they would do is showcase and encourage this national folklore of your region. And the Brothers Grimm is a good example because they did it for part of nationalistic pride. So during the earliest 19th century, the Brothers Grimm, it was Jacob and Willem, became well known for collecting fairy tales. So their book, Grimm's Fairy Tales, was a significant effort to preserve German folklore. And they aimed to instill this sense of Germanic national pride by showcasing the unique cultural heritage found within these stories. So while they aim to stay faithful to these oral traditions and retelling them, they also made editorial choices that reflected sort of the moral and ethical values of their time. So they used that to transform them into what they wanted to say about the world they were living in. But European fairy tales are a testament to the power of storytelling, its ability to adapt to cultural landscapes. They go from the roots of this oral tradition to literary preservation, where they're sort of locked into place. And they sort of reshaped historical events and cultural beliefs, because they put them down to print according to the way they wanted to tell them. So European fairy tales offer sort of a window into the values and the fears and the goals of the societies at that time. And these stories continue to be retold and reimagined, and they remain this vital shared part of our cultural heritage. I mean, they sort of bring the past and the present into this sort of weaving together of all these stories. Think of, there could be, the original stories were like very dark, and over time they became a little bit lighter, and then we reached to the point where we Disneyfy them, where they become very sweet and there's always a happy ending. But this wasn't true in the early ones. They were very, very dark. In, I believe it's Cinderella, the Wicked Stepmother. It's Cinderella or it's Snow White, one of the two. I would have to look it up. Where it's either the Wicked Queen or the Wicked Stepmother, and one of those two stories is forced to put on iron shoes that have been put in the fireplace and dance in them until she dies. So quite different than the stories that we tell today. But so think about it. What are some of the ones that have influenced you? What are some of the fairy tales that you've liked? Go back. It's interesting to see if you can see what their origins are and what the story was like at the time it was written, and also how it's connected to folklore. And if it's connected to folklore, is there magic in the story? How is it connected to magic? And, that's what we talk about here all the time: magic, folklore. And does it influence the way you look at any of that? Does it change anything? Does it maybe show you the origins of some magic you're still using today? So this has been Papa G. I hope you enjoyed this. We'll probably talk more about fairy tales, maybe focus on some different ones and what they mean and what they can actually bring for today. Thanks for joining me. Till later. Bye bye.